So welcome everyone to our L'chaim Center, our first Jewish medical ethics discussion. And tonight's topic, we are talking about defining the point of death. And
Gotta talk a little louder,
okay, we're discussing defining the point of death and organ donation. And we are privileged to have with us Dr. Dee-Dee, who is joining us, who is Dee-Dee, please, will you introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everybody. It's nice to meet you. Thank you for welcoming me. I am new to the area. I live in Libertyville, and I am a new hire to AbbVie, where I'm doing phase 1 research on healthy volunteers. I'm a trained gynecologist, and actually, I have a history of studying medical ethics. So I went to Bravenders in Israel, which some of you might know of, and did a lot of study in Gemara. And then I went to Stern College and graduated from there. And I had the honor and pleasure of meeting Moshe quite a few times while I was there. And he'll be mentioned a few times. And then I also had the honor of sitting on Sinai Hospital of Baltimore's medical ethics committee for 12 years. And here I am.
Okay, how should we begin?
Okay, so the first thing we were going to do is just start on a very basic level. What is the difference between medical ethics or bioethics and Jewish medical ethics, right? So when we look at what ethics is in turn, not Jewish, but from the basic tenets of ethics are, if you broke it down to 4, there are some models that have 7, but we'll just do the basic 4, and that's beneficence, doing good, non-maleficence, not do no harm, right? Autonomy, the patient always has the freedom to choose, and justice, that we ensure fairness. The difference between regular bioethics and Jewish medical ethics is that that comes from a societal framework. What is best for society? And I think we need to go back to the basics, right? When God made the world, he made an individual. That individual stands for something. And so in Judaism, when we look at ethics, we look at it in the framework of a halachic perspective, which means that we actually look at the conversation between how rabbis interpret specific laws. And we always look at the individual purpose. And we never say that a single individual can take the place of a community or vice versa. So you have to be very cautious. And so actually, I was kind of interested in the idea of this, and I looked back and I saw that Rabbi Jonathan Sachs from England, he was the chief rabbi there for many years, and he basically said that the individual is created in God's image. And so we have to continue that by looking at Jewish medical ethics from the perspective of the individual within the framework of Jewish law. And it's very important for us to realize that Judaism doesn't have a Vatican, right? So a lot of the things that we're going to talk about today are a bit controversial sometimes, right? So even there's reform thought, there's conservative thought, there's reconstruction thought, right? There's lots of different factions within Judaism, but even within the Orthodox perspective, there's lots of different ideas within it. And we're going to try to kind of bring some of that to the forefront, but know that I personally am giving none of the criteria from a Jewish law perspective. And that it's always taken from what's happening today and what the facts of the actual case are. So it's hard to talk in generalities.
Right. And I think one of the nice parts was when we were discussing it, we were trying to pull things, and I was like saying, I don't have any skin in the game. All I'm trying to do is try and pull out the resources and see what we have in front of us and try and clarify what the Torah is guiding us. We always look towards the Torah as a guide, and we want to know what the Torah is guiding us with regards to how to go about doing these things. The first establishment, what we need to do, first of all, is understand that, or establish that if God created the world and God runs the world, which is our belief, then if a person gets sick, perhaps all we should be doing is not necessarily turning to the science world, but we should perhaps just be praying to God and asking Him to heal us. And to this, the Talmud actually deals specifically with this commandment. Perhaps one should not be returning to a doctor. And the Gemara goes and pulls out a verse in, I think it's in this coming week Torah portion, where it talks about when one injures someone else, what financial repercussions one has to have in order to pay the person back. And one of them is, it says, "V'rapo yirapeh," you shall pay him for their medical bills. That if a person injures someone else, you have an obligation to pay for their medical bills. And our sages say, "Mikan shnitan l'rofeh reshut l'rapo." From here, permission is given or granted or obligation for a doctor to heal, and there is an obligation for us to go to a doctor and to receive healing from the doctor. And therefore, we are obligated not just to listen to a doctor, but we're obligated to go to a doctor, especially if there are life-saving capacities, in order to be able to receive healing from a doctor. Okay. So now, what we want to go in, we want to talk a bit about the obligation of saving life and how that plays into practice with regards to organ donation.
Right, so what we were gonna do is we were gonna break it down into the different types of organ transplantation. And based on them, then we can come to what the questions are in Judaism. Can you, should you, are we commanded to? So let's just take one of the easiest ones. Can you be a live donor? A live donor is something like a kidney donation, where you have where the donor has possibly two healthy kidneys and they're donating to someone in need, right? That person could potentially die or be required to be on dialysis with a poor quality of life without that kidney, right? There's also other live donation. There's a live donor who can give bone marrow. And so those are very different, right? Bone marrow transplantation is generally a very quick and easy procedure where we take a needle into the bone marrow, and if you are a match, then you can use it for patients who might need it, like with leukemias, right? And so what happens is we take the bone marrow from the healthy person, put it into a cancer patient, and then that healthy, after we suppress the cancer patient's cells, the healthy bone marrow then kind of grows within the sick person's body and then proliferates healthy blood cells instead of cancer blood cells. And so those are two very different procedures. When someone has a kidney transplant, they actually have to undergo a significant surgical procedure and they have a recovery. And we really have mastered that. The major risks to the donor are significantly reduced. But then again, we also ask, does a Jewish person who has two healthy kidneys, should they give? Should they? Can they? Should they? Must they? Right? Then we have the idea of bone marrow, which isn't as much of a procedure. And so the rabbi's going to talk about some of the law perspectives.
Right. So with regards to, we'll start with the easiest. And why should do I have an obligation to my fellow with regards to saving their life or enabling them a healthier life? Sorry, there's someone who keeps popping in. Okay. I'm just so nervous sitting next to the fancy doctor. That's why.
Somehow I don't.
I'm trying.
No, you're not. You're not a father. Thank you.
Okay, so the first is the idea of the obligation of saving another person's life. Okay, there is a Torah obligation that if I'm able to save another person's life, I have to save his life, even at the cost of my own finances. Okay, and then the question comes into that into play with regards to what about at the cost of my own health? Do I have an obligation to save another person's life at the cost of my own health? So we'll start with there's a Gemara in Sanhedrin. The Talmud in Sanhedrin says that if someone is drowning in a river, or an animal is about to attack him, or he's about to be attacked by robbers, we have an obligation to save them. The Torah says you shall not stand by the blood of your brother. There's a Torah obligation to not stand by while one's brother, one's fellow Jew is lying and is at their life is in danger, and we have an obligation to go and save them, even at the cost of one's own finances. According to many halakhic opinions, when we were talking about bone marrow donation, there's no danger whatsoever, not any major loss. Then there is actually an obligation, according to most halakhic opinions, one has an obligation to save another person's life. One has an obligation to donate bone marrow. With regards to kidneys, it is still up in the air with regards to the person has that capacity of making that decision or not. We cannot force a person to donate a kidney in order to save another individual. That definitely is up. With regard to something that's very important is to what degree is this Torah, is this a Torah, how seriously do we take the obligation of saving another person's life? And that we have another Talmud passage, which is in Yuma, which talks about that even a very distant capacity of saving a person's life. And the example is that Shabbos, desecration of Shabbos is very high up in the prohibition list. And if we're not sure, if the Gemara, the case that happens is that a mapolis, a wall falls down, and we're not sure if there is a person who the wall fell over or not. And we want to clear away the rubble to see if there is a person there or not. So we're not even sure if there is a person there or not. And even if the person is there, we're not sure if the person is alive or dead. The Torah says we have an obligation to save them and to go and dig out the rubble, which is a prohibition in the Torah. One's not allowed to dig away rubble on Shabbat, but one's allowed to do that even in a situation where there's what we call a suffix person, not sure whether the person's there or not, and even if you're not sure whether the person could survive or not, we still have an obligation to try and go there and pull it out. I want to point out actually that in Haiti, as I pronounce it right, was an earthquake there. So the Zaka members, Ultra Orthodox Zaka members, they worked through the Shabbos, and there's film footage of them getting together for a quick Shacharis on Shabbos morning, all putting on their talaisim. The teams were huddled around them, watching them daven a quick Shacharis on Shabbos, morning davening, folding away the talaisim. Everyone on the team kissed, like Haitians, everyone kissed the talaisim, and all went back to continue attempting to find and rescue more people. So there is a halachic question whether one's obligated to save a life only of a Jew or of a non-Jew, and we all hold that one has halach obligation to save a Jew. What makes the difference, a Jew or non-Jew, we have that obligation. And then we talk about, so should we go into the organ donation is the next thing? Cadaveric. Okay, go.
Okay.
Yes.
So the next level would be cadaveric donation, where create a dead body to take those organs for somebody else, right? Because in Judaism, we really take that very seriously. We bury someone usually within 24 to 48 hours, right? We do it very, very quickly. We try not to perform autopsy unless it has the potential to help someone, right? And we definitely are not proponents of cremation. And so what can we do from cadaveric transplantation? We can do cornea. You can actually at times take a kidney. It's not that great, but it can be helpful. And then actually now we're learning new ways to harvest new things. So we are trying to do face transplantation. There has also been hand transplantation, but those are not usually from, they can or can't be from cadaveric, but most of the time they're from brain dead. But let's talk first about cadaveric before we get, well, can you disagree with that?
Oh, perfect. Thank you. Yeah, so there is a prohibition, another prohibition in the Torah. Lo salin ala meis, one's not allowed to allow a person who has cancer, there's an obligation to treat the dead with extreme honor. And there is a huge obligation to treat the dead with honor, so much so that, for example, a Kohen is not allowed to come into contact with the dead, full stop. No Kohen's allowed to come into contact. A Kohen Gadol, how much more so a high priest is not allowed to come into contact, in physical contact with the dead, or not allowed within the same room and same building as the dead. However, if a Kohen or Kohen Gadol comes across a dead person, they are obligated to, what's the word, impurify themselves, I don't know, in order to bury the person. So your holiness gets pushed aside in order for you to take care of this dead person, which means that we have an obligation of, one may not lay around with a body, because we give it tremendous respect. We give tremendous respect. A lot of it has to do with regards to the soul, that during the separation of the soul from the body, the soul is still in the area and it sees the body, and it's very painful for the soul to see the body being desecrated. And we have an obligation, therefore, to immediately bury the body as soon as possible, to not desecrate the body, and not do whatever we would wish to with the body. However, once again, when it comes to saving a person's life takes precedence over all mitzvot, including cadaveric donation. And therefore, when it comes to cadaveric donation, we are allowed, one may harvest organs from a body if it is with regards to enabling another to save their life. Okay, yeah.
So then the next question is, what about organ transplantation like a heart or a liver? So that can only happen if we meet the criteria for brain death. So I think we have to go back historically. So there was something called the Harvard criteria for brain death, which happened in, I think it was 1968. And so what that was what is brain death? What does death mean? Is death when your heart stops? Is death when you stop breathing? You know, it's kind of like that scene from The Princess Bride. Is he dead? Is he fully dead? Is he not? And so where is that criteria for death? And so it's very important that we talk about brain death together, because people constantly think that when we talk about an intensive care patient and we say this patient unfortunately is brain dead, they sometimes think that the patient or their loved one is in a coma or a vegetative state. And so to explain this, we really have to talk about what is the brain. So we have two parts of the brain. We have the cortex, the big part of the brain, and then we have the brainstem. The cortex is what helps you think, what helps you eat, what helps you taste, what helps you do things cognitively. And that is what gives you your consciousness. The brainstem, however, is what gives you the ability to breathe, right? It is the central portion of the brain that is like controlling all of our major organs. Now, when we say that someone has brainstem death or brain death, you know, there's a lot of different terms out there. I just want us to be all on the same page. We are not just talking about the cortex or the brainstem. Okay, so actually.
She's
what
so
we-
nice. I like her.
Can people stop, can people stop talking?
Mute yourselves. Please.
That's okay.
Can everybody mute, please?
So when we talk about brain death, we are saying that the entire brain is now dead. So what generally happens is a person who has undergone, let's say, a significant trauma. They were in a terrible car accident and they are deemed to be brain dead. What happens in that situation is that there's significant swelling of the brain to the point where there is no longer blood flow to the brain itself. The brain is no longer getting any oxygen. We can actually diagnose this with imaging. We can actually see that there is no longer any blood flow from the body to the head. I think that's really important to know. The other thing we can do is we say, if somebody has just some problem with their upper brain, right, we can test that. We can test their neurologic function. And when we want to test somebody to see if they have brain death, right, we will generally look to see, are their pupils reacting to light? Do they have a gag reflex? Can they still react to pain? And what is happening when someone meets the criteria for brain death is that because of the lack of oxygen to the brain and the lack of blood flow to the brain, you have lysis or breakdown of those cells. It is irreversible. So everyone asks me, you're telling me that someone who's brain dead can't come back. And I am saying they cannot come back. If they meet all the Harvard criteria for death, they cannot wake up from brain death. If someone has a persistent vegetative state where they may or may not be able to breathe on their own, but they still have part of their brainstem intact and they still may have some blood flow to their brain, that's called a vegetative state. That is possibly irreversible. And so I think that it's really important that we are all on the same page when we talk about this, because in Judaism, it's been difficult. We have some Rabban who feel that there, and Rabbi Levy's going to talk a little bit more in detail about it. Some Rabban would say that there's just cardiac death. Some would say, no, it is okay to have the criteria for brain death to be brainstem death. So there we go.
Okay.
Was that clear?
I do want to point out a couple of things that something that's very interesting with regards to the obligation of saving a person's life, how seriously we take this, and we ultimately are going to be we're juggling two very difficult situations. There are two obligations in the Torah when we get back to the sources. The first is there's a prohibition. There's a prohibition called lo tirtzach, do not murder. And that means that we are prohibited of murdering a human being, any human being, no matter what state they may be. And even minutes before they are set to expire, we have an obligation, we're prohibited of removing their soul, of killing them prior to their death. That is the one. The other is we have an obligation of saving a life. And the obligation of saving a life is so serious. I actually wanted to just quote it, although it's a bit relevant to before. The Gemara actually says, with regards to saving a life, well, let's say we have two situations. We have one person who's a secular Jew who doesn't really care about Shabbat, and then you have someone who's an Orthodox rabbi or ultra-Orthodox rabbi, ultra-Orthodox, great, and they both have the opportunity getting into the car to take a person to the hospital, who would one take preference? The one who's secular, who would anyways drive on Shabbat, or someone who's the ultra-Orthodox rabbi? One would think, perhaps since he never drives on Shabbat, we would let the other person take this person to save their life on Shabbat. The Gemara is very clear. Ve'ein osim dvarim halal. We don't save a person's life by desecrating the Shabbat. Lo al yedei goyim, not through non-Jews. V'lo al yedei kutin, other non-Jews. El al yedei gedolei Yisrael. Rather, the great sages of Israel are the ones that have the obligation to go and save the life. So we take it very seriously. And there's actually a story where one of the great Torah sages, they needed to go and call, it was in Europe, they needed to call a doctor on Shabbat, and his students were there, and they said, we'll go. He said, no, I'm going to go. And he went and he came back, and the students asked him, why didn't you let us go? You didn't have to go and desecrate the Shabbat. You didn't have to desecrate the Shabbat in your life. And he said, you wouldn't have taken the obligation to desecrate the Shabbat seriously enough, and therefore I went myself. So there's a huge obligation on that side with regards to, if we have an opportunity of defining that a person is dead, to utilize their organs in order to save another person's life, how much more so do we have that obligation to go and harvest the organs in order to save another person's life? With regards to establishing who is dead and who is alive, that is going to boil down to a very simple point. The simple point is, in Judaism, we define a person who is alive by their soul being within them. And a person who is dead is someone whose soul has departed the body. And the question is, at what point has the soul clearly departed the body? There is strong pull towards saying that the soul departs the body as soon as the brainstem has stopped living. And I mean, you could talk a bit about that, but it's ultimately the definition that's given in the Talmud is that a person stops breathing. A person stops breathing, or perhaps his heart stops beating. Those are the two definitions. There is another quote in the Talmud which talks about that a person who is decapitated, or an animal that is decapitated, they're considered dead. And then the whole discussion is, does it mean that a person who's been decapitated, or an animal that has been decapitated, is that since the brain is no longer there, so the brain can no longer tell the lungs to take in a breath, and therefore the heart will stop, and therefore the person will pass at that point in time when the heart stops? Or is it a few minutes beforehand where we talk about where once the head has been decapitated, then that is defined as the actual point of death. And that is a huge discussion in halachic things. Would you like to tell us about it?
Well, I think that there's also something else to discuss. What happens to the heart, right? So if we deem someone to be brain dead, the reason families get very upset is one of the main reasons is, well, their heart's still beating. Why is their heart still beating? So when we put someone on a mechanical ventilator, there's still it's actually basically just, there's actually just a nerve that's continuing to allow it's an electrical wave that goes through the heart, and it allows it to continue pumping.
Called a pacemaker.
Exactly. So if that pacemaker were to stop, then we could no longer perfuse the oxygen to the rest of the organs. So there's a difference. Is this an organism now that's alive, or are we just maintaining the aliveness of those individual organs until transplantation can happen? So
Okay, fine.
okay. So there's so Rabbi Levy's going to discuss this kind of push and pull in Judaism. Is it okay to use brain death as a criteria for death? If you can use brain death as that criteria, then you can harvest organs. If you don't believe in that, then you can't harvest organs, because you would then have to use cardiopulmonary death as your definition of death.
Okay, so Rabbi Moshe Feinstein was the leading Torah halachic opinion in the United States. He passed in 1986, and he wrote hundreds, if not thousands, of responsa throughout his lifetime, and 3 responsa that spoke very similar towards, leaning very strongly towards the definition that brain death is a sufficient point with regards to halachic death. And that was taken by his son-in-law, Rabbi Mordechai Tendler, who pushed that agenda across, and the Rabbinical Council of America actually published their definition that brain death is a sufficient establishment of point in time with regards to a person's death that defines a person as having died. And that was published in the early 90s. In 1991, that came across to Israel. And the 2 leading halachic authorities in Israel were Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Auerbach and Rabbi Yosef Shalom Elyashiv. Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, he passed in 1903, and Rabbi Elyashiv, he passed in 2010, I believe. Great Torah scholars with phenomenal breadth. When the Rabbinical Council of America's establishment came across, when their opinion came across, they took Rabbi Elyashiv and Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Auerbach to a very strong stance, and they said as follows. Actually, we were requested to reveal our perspective regarding heart transplantation and similarly other organs to save others who are sick. As long as the heart beats, and even in situations where the entire brain, including the brain stem, does not function, otherwise known as brain dead, it is our opinion that there is no permissibility to remove any of the patient's parts, and this would consist of murder. Signed, Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Auerbach and Rabbi Yosef Shalom Elyashiv in 1991. From that point on, that kind of took a long turn, because what happened was Professor Abraham Steinberg, who's a well-known doctor in Jewish medical ethics, he was very close both to Rabbi Elyashiv and Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. And what Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Auerbach attempted to do over the next 2 years, and subsequently passed, he tried to establish what really is the halachic points of death. And suffice it to say, he came across the point that he really wanted the heart. He wanted to hear that a person would stop breathing, and they needed to remove the ventilator. They want to be able to remove the ventilator and then see that a person is actually stopped, that there's no actual breath going on, which will happen automatically if the brainstem is dead. If the brainstem is dead, that would automatically happen. He wanted that to happen for 30 seconds. That was his criteria. 30 seconds of the person not breathing. And if the doctors are able to get the heart back to function immediately after that, then they consider the person having passed, and one would be able to harvest the organs. Since that point in time, there is a huge movement. I mean, the Rabbinical Council of America has created the codes. Yeah. Okay.
Okay. So there's a really cool organization that started about 20 years ago. It's called HODES, Halachic Organ Donation. And I carry a card with me, and it's a blue card. So on my license, it has a star, which says that I'm interested in organ donation. But then they would not harvest unless they had the permission of my loved ones, right? Or unless it was in strict writing, but generally they would have to say that it was from my loved ones. And then I have this card that I carry with me. It's Halachic Organ Donation Society. And so their mission was to save lives by increasing organ donation from Jews to the general public. That was their mission. And then what they then said was, okay, how do we do that? We do that, one, by educating the Jewish community about what the Jewish laws are pertaining to organ transplantation. And what they did was they kind of compiled the opinions of multiple Jewish rabbis across the world, and you can actually choose which one you ascribe to. So if I decided that cardiopulmonary death was the criteria that I wanted, my halachic organ donation thing, when they would call that number, would say, Dee-Dee Schiller, she wanted cardiopulmonary death. She didn't want brain death, or vice versa, right? So this kind of allows for the fabric of Judaism, where, you know, because actually Chabad really doesn't ascribe to brain death as a criteria for death. So that shows you how many opinions there are. And so they also feel that one of the other mission philosophies of HODS is that they assist families in discussing what's going on with organ transplantation and organ donation. So let's say, for example, your loved one is hurt and they have a HODS card and they would like to have the perspective of a specific rabbi. What they'll do is they'll take all of the details of the case, then they'll talk to the rabbis who have a similar philosophy, and they'll help kind of be the bridge between the family and the medical institution that's housing the loved one.
How long does that take?
It really depends on each case. So, you know,
But
sometimes,
don't organs have to be harvested within a very relatively short amount of time, hours?
it really depends on what organs we're talking about and how much perfusion there is. So it depends on so many different things. It's actually not so clear.
Well, I mean, if a person is intubated and it's considered brain dead, they're able to remain, their heart is able to continue functioning for hours, sometimes 2 to 3 days. It has been found there was a pregnant woman who actually lasted 23 days. So we're talking about a number of hours where something like this happens, that one is able to process that. And, you know, when we're talking about death, there is something that happens immediately. We take a lot of responsibility from that perspective.
And the other thing that generally happens too is that in order to meet the criteria for brain death, generally you re-examine the patient twice. I think it's within 6 hours. So, and it's usually by 2 separate teams, or a specific hospital has a team that's called the brain death team. And they'll come in and say, this person meets this criteria, and then they reevaluate a second time. So it's really not a snap judgment, and there is definitely time to have a family and the rabbinic council to get involved.
You know, when the heart stops, what day is brain death from there?
Oh,
If I'm treating it in an operating room, when the first patient's heart stops, several minutes for them to get the heart going. And during that period of time, the patient was able to describe what was going on. Surgical during that period of time when the heart.
oh, right, like a near-death experience.
Well, not, no, just exactly what was going on in the accurately what was going on in the surgical room. We're trying to revive the heart.
Right. I do want to also point out, I mean, I did not mention this, but the Israeli rabbinate, the Israel chief rabbinate, they also went from the perspective and defining death as brain death. It becomes a very complicated issue when, if, for example, an individual does not hold a brain death as a point of death, but needs the heart to stop beating. if they become a donor, then essentially, and they believe that you cannot harvest, then essentially they're believing that makes it very complicated that if they're receiving a heart from someone who's brain dead, they consider they're ultimately assisting in murder. So it becomes very complicated with regards to, are you allowed to, if you hold up this opinion, are you allowed to stand in line to receive an organ? If that and you said something about Israel becoming
Oh, right. So actually, I think one of the reason Hodes came about was because about 20 to 30 years ago, Israel was a member of the European Union's organ transplantation. So you know how in the United States, if someone's on the organ transplantation list, they need a liver, let's say, and then someone meets the criteria for brain death and has a viable liver in Texas, and they're in Illinois, then we fly that liver here, right? And so our country has its own pool of organs. Well, Israel was considered part of the European Union's transplant system. And unfortunately, there was a lack of education around this. Jews automatically thought, we don't believe in brain death, we just don't. And so there was a lack of organs being donated to the system, and there was actually a fear that Israel would be dropped out of that pool for organ transplantation. And I also just want to make one comment, because, you know, you might think that a brain dead, let's say you don't believe in cardiopulmonary death, right? You might say to yourself, well, the quality of life of someone who meets the criteria for brain death is minimal, right? We should try to save that 17-year-old boy who needs that liver, right? We should, but in Judaism, we don't do that. We actually say that regardless of the quality of life of that human being, as long as we deem them to be alive, that's why this is such a hard scenario, right? Because when we talk about the goses, which is somebody who's basically on their deathbed, right? Can you stop the woodcutter from making noise that's keeping that person alive? Can you take the salt off their tongue that's keeping them alive? We do everything in our power to maintain someone's life. So if someone does not meet the criteria of death and you withdraw care, that is murder, which is against the 10 Commandments.
I do want to end with this statement that our sages say, "Kol matzil nefesh achat miYisrael kilu hitzil olam maleh." If a person saves one soul, it's as if we've saved an entire world. And we look at that from huge obligation. We see saving a life with tremendous respect and diligence and awe. With, you know, are we able to? And if we are able to, how can we go about doing that? It's one of those major parts behind Judaism where we're not just living in our own little personal bubble and it's only me and I don't care about anything that's happening around outside. If I'm able to save a life, I have an obligation to save a life. And if I'm able to save a life, and I do, I achieve a tremendous amount. I partner with God in that God is the creator of life, and I partner with him in passing that on and saving and enabling more of life. So I thank you all for joining us. Anything else? Are we open? Should we open for questions?
Yeah,
Any
please.
questions so far? Yeah.
Actually, I have two. Cadaveric, as far as I can tell, you've only been talking about saving lives, saving another person. And while you were talking about that, I was thinking the transplanting a cornea, or even a kidney, you know, the kidney can be taken care of by dialysis. How does that work?
I like your question,
And
because
the other question is, if you can do it without spending a long time, what about how do non-Jews, what's their major criteria for transplant?
so I'll start with the easier one, your first question. So we believe that having the ability to see, you know, being a functional human being still is so important, right? So for cadaveric, you know, defiling a body to get a cornea is probably halachically permissible, but it's also important to know that there is a Jewish law that says that if you do not completely defile the person, you don't take their arm, it's not obvious that you've done it, then you could take whatever you need for the quality of life of someone else.
Internal versus external.
Right, exactly.
I thought you were going to go into with regards to being able to donate one's body to science, which that
Oh.
is prohibited
They wouldn't
from a
want
Jewish
my body,
perspective.
so-
But what was the other question?
Non-Jews versus non-Jews, like if we could give to non-Jews?
No, what are the criteria for non-Jews in terms of death?
So if you look at the bigger picture, just in a hospital situation, most states require the acceptance of brain death today. Almost every single one. I mean, there are situations where people refused. So I believe New Jersey is one of the only one in the country. So there's a situation there's a story about this young girl who actually had a tonsillectomy gone awry. She was about 10 years old. And I want to say she's Jamaican descent. And she was in, I don't remember what state, but they transferred her to New Jersey and they maintained her on a ventilator for years, actually, because the family refused to withdraw support. But they had to move her out of that state because the state would no longer pay for her care. Because in almost every single state, that's the criteria.
Oh, I was going to say one more point. Like some of us, we try. The question is, how common is brain death with regards to injuries? It's important to know. I believe it's very common with regards to, for example, car accidents. In that, what happens? And I'm not the doctor, but what happens is a head injury. What happens is the brain will begin to expand. The brain begins to expand, the blood stops being able to flow into the brain. And then the brain will, because the blood is not able to flow into the brain, then the brain stops functioning and dies. And that's very, very common typically in car accidents, where there's an injury to the head. They will immediately, the emergency workers will immediately put the person on a ventilator and transport them in an attempt to save them. Usually they'll try and induce a coma in order to stop the brain from expanding. But that is how it happens. So, I mean, it is something that happens very often, and it's a very common thing. And how well prepared one is beforehand enables one to take advantage of the situation. It's something we don't want to talk about. It's something we prefer not to be involved with. And at the same time, it's something that we have an obligation to be careful about, God forbid, of being a partner in, God forbid, a murder. There's an obligation of, if we call that could be considered murdering, and being partner of that is prohibited. So it's very important to be educated and to be proactive from that perspective in order to ensure that we take advantage and are able to participate in these situations. Dan.
Could you talk a little bit more about how do you get information?
You just go on their website.
And what is the website?
It's HODS. Halachic Organ Donation Society. I think that's it. .org, maybe.
Codes.org.
Codes.org. And on their website, it's excellent. They tell you how to think about it. They show you the different rabbis. A lot of them even have videos, and you can choose how you want to proceed.
Bonnie.
So how does one handle someone who has been intubated? But what's the decision or the halacha around taking them off the vent?
That's-
How will they know if these people have in fact passed on when they're on a ventilator?
Okay, so, I mean, it depends if you're discussing, if the person does not meet criteria for brain death,
And
right?
you can make that criteria even when you're on a ventilator?
Uh-huh. Yeah, so actually, in order to harvest those organs, the person is maintained on a ventilator. Is that-
I just wondered,
So in,
if something like.
in
goes
most
on, like
hospitals, there's
somebody
something
doesn't
now-
die.
in most hospitals today, there's something called an allow natural death. So in the old days, we used to call it do not resuscitate. So most of the time, we don't say that anymore. We actually use the term allow natural death. So, you know, I urge everyone to have a discussion with their families about what they would want, right? Would you want to chronically be on a ventilator? Would you want to have a shock to your heart if your heart would stop? You know, you need to really come to terms with what that is. And sometimes that might, and in terms of life and death matters, I really think it's important to have a rabbi that your family trusts and that you can have an open conversation about what you might like. So, so you kind of, it's, a lot of these situations are never just set in stone. Sometimes it's, let's assess the activity of this person's brain. Let's assess this person's ability to recover. And then another assessment a few days later, once they know more information. So it's not always so clear cut. So sometimes it's kind of like something we have to kind of gauge over time.
Can you tell us, give us some insight into a highly problematic conflict between the halakhic and what we're constrained in between in America?
Could you give?
You mean like something like where somebody is not brain dead, but they didn't want to be vented chronically?
I don't know what it is. I'm just wondering, when you have an external authority, you have a rabbinic approach. If they're not coincident, if they're not the same, then there are going to be circumstances.
So let's take a little Hasidic boy from from a Chabad community, right? Who meets only criteria for brain death and is not considered, you know, dead by his family. And so he's in a state, and as he's in Maryland, where they say that they will no longer care for this child. Yeah, this has happened,
Numerous times
right?
where the state refuses to continue paying for care.
Kind of like the case of that young girl that I talked about.
Are there any in the other direction where the halakha would be not to do something and not to extend, and the common law would facilitate a different approach?
I can't think of the situation.
I don't know.
So
Well,
it doesn't happen very often.
No,
Isn't that sort of like the head injury example you gave? If they're, that they intubate them and then take them to the hospital and assess them. So that would say that the government does intubate them. Because they don't know that the person wants to. So before anybody gets to ask the rabbi, it's done. And then you may or may not have another conversation.
no, in that situation in particular, that's an emergency. The ambulance typically doesn't know what to do,
Right.
so they're gonna err on the side of caution.
Right, the person's not necessarily brain dead at that point.
And they don't have a
Yeah.
true diagnosis.
And they don't know yet.
So they have a responsibility to continue to care for the patient until they have a diagnosis of possible brain death.
what I love about halakha is the ability of being able to pull an ancient Torah that is 3,500 years old to practical modern technology, which really began its advances with heart transplantation, became a very popular thing only in the 80s. And the ability of being able to bring that across the original sources from Torah, from the Gemara, which is 2,000 years old, and bring that across and see how we pull that into practice of what is considered death and what's not considered death. What is considered that the neshama has separated from the body and this person is no longer alive. And then the struggle of trying to evaluate, did the sages have the capacity of integrating into their definition modern technology, which is able to continue to hold a heart beating without the head being attached. Just on a last note, Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, who I had mentioned, part of his discussion, based on the Mishnah that we spoke about that defined death with regards to if an animal's head was decapitated, they ran 2 experiments, and we weren't going to talk about this. He ran 2 experiments with Dr. Abraham Steinberg, where they decapitated a pregnant sheep and wanted to see if they were what would happen to the fetus if they were able to save the life of the fetus. Because there's a Gemara that says that if a sheep is decapitated, the fetus will no longer be able to exist. And the first time they were not successful. The second time they were successful. And he ends off as Dr. Abraham Steinberg, Professor Steinberg, he says that this sheep is still alive and kicking as far as we're aware of today. But what Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Auerbach was able to pull from that was that perhaps the definition of a decapitation does not necessarily have a strong influence with regards to what the situation of the heart is. That if one is able to continue to keep the heart beating through intubation, that does not necessarily say that the person is not dead. But it's a beautiful thing to see the relevance of the Torah till today, as well as the struggle that we have, and we take it as an obligation, and we try and work through each case in each situation with that, and the beauty that we integrate science with regards to the Torah. It's a very, very beautiful thing. So we thank you all for joining us, and did we discuss what subject? Yeah. Oh, this one. Okay.
We were gonna do triage for next month.
So we're gonna try and do this once a month, and we're gonna work on triage next month. For next month, hopefully we'll see you again in a month's time. Otherwise, a couple of announcements. We are having this coming this Friday night. This Friday night we're having Friday Night Live. We'll have dinner. We have a very limited space. I think we're limiting it to 50 individuals. We're having a live Kabbalah Shabbat with Rabbi Ilan Brownstein, who's an awesome individual, beatboxer, well-known, and he's going to be joining us. And then a great dinner over here, community dinner. And Women's Wine and Wisdom. That's right.
Yes.
Women, Wine, and Wisdom over there with Eve.
And me
And Dr.
talking
Dee-Dee.
about intimacy. I am an OBGYN.
So stay in touch. Thank you all for joining us. And we enjoyed it. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all for joining us.
Yeah. Did I do that justice?
Yes, you did.